Okay, AP Psych class, we are on video 2 for Unit 8, Part B. This is on expressed emotion. Our first video was on embodied emotion and emotional theories, like what was happening physiologically inside of us to generate feelings. And now we're going to talk about the outward expression of those emotions. And so there are three main ideas to this presentation. The first is talking about our ability to detect emotion. We're actually very adept at reading nonverbal cues. We often are good at listening for changes in tone concerning voice. And so this is something that's probably led well to our survival as a species, as we'll get to later. But we are especially good in general at detecting threats. There's been lots of research that has shown that when individuals are subliminally flashed different vocabulary words, that words that have negative connotation, like danger or snake, those often tend to be the words that are more easily identified when those research participants are tested on the subliminal exposure. We also know that when given a crowd of people, the angry faces are the ones that seem to pop out to us in crowds, and so that's good, and that probably again led to the protection of our ancestors to be able to recognize and detect threats and be able to remove oneself from dangerous situations. We also know from research that life experiences, tend to sensitize us to emotion that's being expressed by other people, and this is a sad example. But they have done research studies on children, and they show them faces, like an individual's face that had, a photograph being taken when the person is showing a fearful expression, and then one that is shown an angry expression, and then using computer-generated images to kind of morph the two together and transition from the fearful face to the angry face. And unfortunately, children that have been victims of abuse are much more skilled at detecting when anger begins to show in that face, or when the fear morphs into anger, and they characteristically are much better at this than their peers who are not victims of abuse. And so sadly, that was probably something again that led to them getting out of abusive situations, is being able to recognize quickly and accurately when an abuser's expression transition to anger. So experience does sensitize us. Emotion and detecting gender, is it a stereotype that females tend to be the more sensitive of genders? Whether or not it's culturally or a result of culture or a result of biology, that remains debated, but research does show that females tend to be better at detecting emotion. Concerning increased sensitivity to nonverbals, females, when in experiments, tend to describe emotional experiences in more complex terms than do males, and females are also more likely to show empathy, which tends to make them better at detecting future emotions. Again, refer back to that experience sensitizing us to emotional changes. What about culture and emotional expression? This is, a little dabble into the world of anthropology here. But gestures, you should know, are not culturally universal, as evidenced by countless, diplomats and politicians that inadvertently flash rude gestures to people based on not understanding cultural differences. Like A-OK, as a hand sign, is often viewed as rude by many other cultures. And so keeping those sorts of things in mind is important. Facial expressions tend to be universal, however. We're remarkably good at recognizing emotional expressions in the face, regardless of the person's culture of origin. And so that, shows the universal nature of facial expressions. Another example is children who have been blind from birth. How is it that they smile when they're happy or frown when they're sad if they've never seen another human being's face contort in those ways? And so there has to be some sort of heritage that we all share. Darwin was very interested in those sorts of observations. His theory is that before we had language to convey meaning, that those sorts of nonverbal facial expressions probably did aid our ancestors in survival. And there's also, when you think about it, a lot of physical connections to why we express ourselves the way that we do. For example, a surprise face, widening of eyes, opening up of nostrils and mouth as we elongate our face in shock and amazement. It is, I guess, increasing, the amount that we are taking in of sensory stimuli, like smelling more, tasting more or seeing more as a result of opening, the eyes and the mouth and the nose. When you are disgusted by something yucky, we crinkle our nose, we close our nostrils off to the yucky smell. We squint our eyes so that we don't have to see the grotesque thing. And so perhaps that maybe also is lending to why facial expressions tend to be more universal. What does vary concerning facial expressions is how much emotion is displayed. That tends to be hinged upon whichever culture you've been raised in. How much of your emotions you express is still culturally bound. Okay, and then our last section here, just talking about the effects of facial expressions. William James, Charles Darwin were doing early observations and hypothesizing, if that's a word, concerning the effects of facial expressions. William James actually, in battling, sadness and depression, wondered if going through the outward movements of sitting up straight and smiling could actually change people's embodied emotion or your feelings inside. That do the expressions only reflect what's going on concerning your emotions, or do they amplify and even at times regulate our emotions? So that was something that he was interested in, in the early years of psychology. Remember, William James was first a philosopher, so it makes sense that he would question those sorts of things. And then Charles Darwin, through his observations, said that free outward expression of emotion intensifies it. And so his examples were of cultures that, fly off the handle or outwardly express anger versus more withdrawn cultures that you see a difference, and that actually holding things in might be better than flying off the handle, because the outward expression of an emotion is only intensifying that feeling, which kind of goes against popular culture's notion that venting is cathartic. Maybe not so much. Okay, James Laird develops what is known as this idea of facial feedback, and that again, what William James and Charles Darwin were doing in a more just observing behavior and hypothesizing about its causes. James Laird is doing your legitimate scientific psychological research. And so Laird kind of confirms, what they had both said, that facial expressions intensify the emotions that they represent. And so he refers to that as facial feedback. Tiffany Ito and her crew of researchers kind of take it beyond what James Laird had researched and scientifically support what William James had believed all along, that you can actually alter. It's not just an intensity, but that you can actually alter or awaken specific emotions just as a result of outward expression of them, whether or not they are embodied first or expressed. These are intertwined. Ito's famous experiment was taking individuals and forcing them to hold a pen horizontally, like to the floor, inside their mouth, which to hold it in there would force people's facial muscles to contort in what would normally be a smile if there wasn't a big old pen in their mouth. And she had them look at a computer screen of random faces. And then she would, after doing that with the experimental group, would have both experimental and control group, the non-pen groups, take what's known as the implicit attitude test, which really is just a computer-generated test that kind of deals with people's snap judgments of people. I will talk about it later in the social psychology unit. But she found that people that had been forced to hold the pen in their teeth and they were forced to smile while looking at faces, when they went to take the implicit attitude test, actually exhibited a decrease in racial bias in how they answered that. And so they were kind of more or less judgmental of people of different races than their own. And so that kind of supports and extends like all that earlier work, but with more scientific backing. And so there you go. That's expressed emotion. Video 3 will talk about experienced emotion. And so bring any questions that you have regarding this to class. Thanks for listening.